6 months is not a long time. Not really. 6 months is enough to bury a man, hold a funeral, watch strangers in dark suits disappear back into the world they came from. It's enough to return to a diner and start pulling double shifts again. Enough to convince yourself, most mornings, that the strangest chapter of your life is closed and what comes next will be ordinary. Sarah Mitchell had almost managed to believe that. Almost. She was refilling the salt shakers on a Tuesday morning, the kind of grey, unremarkable Tuesday that exists only to be forgotten, when the door opened and a woman she had never seen before walked into the diner. She was somewhere in her 50s. Silver-streaked hair pulled back, with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped caring about how it looked and started caring only about whether it stayed out of her eyes. Dark coat, good shoes, worn at the heel. The kind of face that had been handsome once and had traded beauty for something more. Useful a stillness, a watchfulness, the look of a person who walked into rooms the way other people walked into intersections, checking both directions before she moved. She didn't look at the menu board. She didn't look at her phone. She scanned the room the way Walter used to scan rooms. And then her eyes found Sarah, and she walked directly to the booth. By the window, Walter's booth, and sat down. Sarah brought coffee without being asked. It felt automatic. It felt like muscle memory from a life that was supposed to be over. Black, the woman said, before Sarah could ask. Then, sit down. Please. It wasn't a request. It wasn't quite an order. It was something in between, the tone of a person accustomed to having both options available depending on how the next 10 seconds went. Sarah Saturday. My name is Reeves, the woman said. Diana Reeves. Walter and I worked together for 11 years. He told me once that if he ever died unexpectedly, I should find the girl who carried his notebook. Sarah felt the familiar weight of the old leather notebook in her memory, the coded pages, the foreign cities, the names crossed out and circled. He didn't die unexpectedly, Sarah said carefully. He was 82. Diana Reeves looked at her across the rim of her coffee cup with an expression that said, very clearly, that she appreciated the caution and found it insufficient. Walter Hayes was in better physical health than most men 20 years his junior, she said quietly. His physician of 7 years will tell you that, except that his physician of 7 years filed a death certificate that contradicts everything in Walter's medical history, and then disappeared 4 days later. The salt shaker in Sarah's hand had stopped moving. What do you mean, disappeared? I mean he packed a bag, left his practice, left his home, left his wife a voicemail that said he was sorry, and has not been seen or heard from since. Diana set down her cup. That's not a coincidence, Sarah. That's a message. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it. Diana reached into her coat and slid a photograph across the table. Sarah looked down. It was a picture of herself, outside her apartment building, taken from across the street, slightly elevated, someone with a long lens and a patient disposition. She was carrying groceries. She remembered that afternoon, 3 days ago. She had been completely alone. She had seen no one. Someone has been watching you, Diana said, since before Walter was buried, which means they were watching him in his final weeks, which means his death wasn't peaceful, Sarah said. The words tasted like ice. Diana didn't answer. She didn't have to. We have a short window, she said instead, before the people who killed Walter realize he left you something they cannot afford to let you keep. Sarah looked at the photograph of herself one more time, at the groceries in her hands, at how completely, utterly unaware she had been. Walter's voice surfaced in her memory, quiet and steady. Don't run in straight lines. Notice what's wrong before you notice what's loud. She raised her eyes to Diana Reeves. Tell me everything, she said. Before we dive in, tell us in the comment section where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and hit the subscribe button. The story Diana told was not a comfortable one. Walter Hayes had not gone gently. Not in the way Millbrook believed. In the weeks before his death, he had been more active than anyone. Around him realized making quiet, careful contacts through channels. So old they barely existed anymore, using communication methods so analog that modern surveillance had simply never thought to look for. Them. He had known, Diana explained, that bringing down Marcus Hale was not the end. It was never going to be the end. Hale had been a significant node in a network that ran far deeper than one corrupt, former CIA officer turned defense contractor. Taking him down had been necessary, but it had also been a signal to people far above Hale's level that someone was still pulling threads. And those people had resources that made the men who'd come to Millbrook that night look like amateurs. He reached out to me 3 months before he died, Diana said. They were sitting in the back office of the diner now, door closed. Voices low. He said he was close to something. Said he'd spent 23 years building a second file one he never showed. Hollis never showed anyone. A complete record of the organization. Above the network Hale managed. Sarah absorbed this slowly. He had more. He always had more, Diana said. That was Walter. You never saw the whole board. You only ever saw the piece he decided to show you. Then where is it? Sarah asked. The second file. Diana looked at her steadily. Where do you think? Sarah's eyes dropped to the old leather notebook sitting on the desk between them. She had carried it with her every day since Walter's funeral. She hadn't been able to explain why. Some instinct, some residue of those 3 terrifying nights in Millbrook had told her to keep it close. She picked it up slowly. The familiar pages, the codes, the cities, the circled names. She had read them dozens of times and understood perhaps a quarter of what they contained. She turned to the back. The final 12 pages, dense with what she had always assumed was Walter's most confused writing tighter than the rest, more compressed, numbers running in patterns she had never been able to follow. I always thought these were different, she said quietly. They are different, Diana said. They're the most important pages in that notebook, and we need someone who can read them. His full name was Victor Lane, and he was 29 years old, and he worked for a private intelligence consulting firm in a city 200 miles from Millbrook, and he answered Diana's call at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night with the wariness of a man who had learned that late calls from Diana Reeves were never about anything simple. He was right. When Sarah and Diana arrived at his apartment the following afternoon, Sarah's first impression was of controlled chaos, books on every surface, 3 screens running simultaneously, a whiteboard covered in cryptographic notation that looked, to Sarah's eyes, like someone had taught mathematics to have a breakdown. Her second impression was that he was afraid. Not of them. Of the notebook, once Diana set it on his desk and explained what it was. This is Cardinal's work, he said, not touching it yet, just looking at it the way someone looks at something beautiful and dangerous. You know who he was? Sarah asked. Everyone in this field knows who Cardinal was, Victor said. Or knew of him. He's basically a myth. One of the last true analog operatives. No digital footprint, no electronic communication. Everything encoded by hand using systems he designed himself. He finally reached out and touched the notebook's cover with 2 careful fingers. I've seen references to his cipher methodology in academic cryptography papers. The actual application of it, he shook his head. I never thought I'd see it. Can you decode it? Diana asked. Victor looked at her, then at Sarah, then back at the notebook. Give me 48 hours, he said. It took him 31. What he found in those final 12 pages when the layers of Walter's encryption peeled back, one by one, was not what any of them expected. Even Diana, who had expected something significant. It was everything. Every transaction. Every payment. Every official. every intermediary, every shell company and offshore account and midnight meeting in a European city that had ever connected to the shadow network above.
Markus Hale.
40 years of careful, patient documentation by a man who had known from the very beginning that Hale was the visible layer of something that went far deeper. Names Sarah didn't recognize. Names she did. Names that appeared in newspapers and history books and congressional committee rosters. And at the center of the web, connected to everything, referenced in Walter's careful notation only as the patron, a name, a real name, a complete name, with dates, with transactions, with the kind of evidence that didn't leave room for reasonable doubt. Victor sat back from his screens and looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping would turn out to be wrong. "Do you know who this is?" he asked. Diana's jaw was tight. "Yes." "Then you know what happens to people who try to move against him?" "Yes," Diana said again. A long silence. "Okay," Victor said finally. "What do we do?" Sarah had been standing in the corner of the room, watching, quiet, turning what she'd learned over in her mind the way Walter used to turn his coffee cup between his palms, thinking before speaking, watching before moving. She looked at the notebook. "We finish what he started," she said. His name in Walter's file was Edmund Carr. To the world, he was something else entirely, a name attached to foundations and endowments, a man whose money had funded hospitals and libraries and university chairs, whose face appeared in the background of important photographs going back 4 decades, always slightly removed from the center of power, always adjacent to it. The kind of man who was so thoroughly respectable that the idea of looking at him closely felt almost rude. He was 91 years old. He had been building his network since before Walter Hayes joined the CIA. He had survived investigations that took down everyone around him. He had survived exposures that should have reached him, and somehow never quite did. He had survived Marcus Hale's arrest, with barely a ripple, because Hale, like everyone before him, had been careful never to know Edmund Carr's real name. Only one person had ever gotten close enough, and patient enough, and careful enough to document the full picture. Cardinal. He's been aware of Walter for decades, Diana told Sarah. The next morning, in Victor's kitchen over bad coffee and worse sleep, he knew Walter was alive. He chose not to move against him directly, because Walter had nothing he could use, or so he believed. Moving against an 82-year-old man with dementia in a small town would have been a risk not worth the reward. But then Marcus Hale was arrested, Sarah said. And suddenly Walter wasn't just a harmless old man anymore. Suddenly he was a thread that led somewhere dangerous. Diana set down her cup. They watched him in his final weeks. When they realized he was active, making contacts, moving pieces, they decided the risk calculation had changed. They killed him, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. It hadn't been a question since Diana first slid that photograph across the diner table. But saying it out loud, in the flat morning light of Victor's kitchen, made it different. Made it real in a way that required something in response. They killed him, Diana confirmed. Quietly. Carefully. The kind of death that looks like nature and isn't. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. He knew, she said slowly. He knew they were watching him. He knew what was coming. She looked at Diana. That's why he left me the notebook. That's why the note said to wait until he was gone. He knew he wasn't going to be able to finish it himself. Diana didn't answer. He chose me, Sarah said. The weight of it settled across her shoulders like something physical. Not because I was trained. Not because I was equipped. Because I was the person nobody would look at. She almost smiled. Almost. He taught me better than I realized. Then, that same afternoon, a message arrived through channels Diana hadn't used in years, delivered by a contact whose name she hadn't heard spoken in over a decade. A single sheet of plain paper.
No signature. No letteread.
5. Words typed in the center. Return the notebook. Walk away. Diana held it for a moment before showing it to Sarah. Sarah read it once. Set it down on the table. Walter didn't walk away, she said. Neither do we. Director Hollis called Sarah's cell phone 3 days later. His voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon. He'd heard about Marcus Hale's case moving forward through proper channels, further revelations, further evidence emerging. He wanted to help. He wanted Sarah to bring what she had directly to him. Let him handle it through official process. The right way. The safe way. He sounds reasonable, Victor said, listening to the recording. Sarah had made of the call a habit she developed without consciously deciding to, the way she developed a dozen other habits. In the last 6 months, things Walter had taught her that her hands and eyes had learned before her mind caught up. He does, Diana said. She was staring at the wall. But, Sarah asked. When I mentioned Edmund Carr's name, Diana said slowly, to test the water, Hollis didn't ask who that was. The room went quiet. He already knew, Sarah said. He's known for years. Diana turned from the wall. The question is what that means. Hollis is not a corrupt man. I've known him for 2 decades. But there are different ways to be compromised. What emerged over the next 48 hours, through a combination of Victor's access to financial records and Diana's network of contacts in places that didn't appear in any organizational chart, was a picture that was sadder than betrayal. 30 years earlier, Hollis had made a single mistake. Not a venal one, not greed or ambition, but a moment of poor judgment. In a high-pressure situation that had resulted in the death of an asset he'd been responsible for. The kind of thing that ended careers. The kind of thing that, if it had come to light, would have destroyed everything he'd spent his life building. Edmund Carr had known about it within 48 hours, and he had kept that knowledge, patient and untouched, for 30 years. Not using it, just holding it. The way you keep a key. Hope never to need. When he finally used it, when Hollis was asked to look the other way at specific moments, to slow walk specific investigations, to make sure certain threads were never pulled, Hollis had complied. Not because he wanted to, but because the alternative was watching everything he'd built collapse, and he had convinced himself, over 30 years of small compromises, that the good he did outweighed the corners he cut. It's an easy story to tell yourself. It almost sounds true. He's not our enemy, Sarah said, when Diana finished. No, Diana agreed. But he's not entirely safe, either. Sarah thought about it for a long moment. I need to talk to him, she said. Alone. They met at a rest stop off a highway, an hour outside the city. The kind of anonymous, public, forgettable location that Walter would have approved of. Hollis arrived alone, as Sarah had requested. He looked older than she remembered from Millbrook. Or maybe she was just looking at him differently now. They sat in Sarah's car. Rain on the windows. The radio off. She didn't ease into it. Walter had taught her that time spent circling something you already know is time given to the other person to prepare their defense. Edmund Carr, she said. Hollis went very still. You've known who he was for years, Sarah continued. You've known he was connected to the network above Hale. And you've been protecting him, not because you wanted to, but because he had something on you that you couldn't afford to have exposed. Hollis stared through the rain-streaked windshield for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. How long have you known? Long enough, Sarah said. Another long silence. Walter knew too, Hollis said. It wasn't a question. He always knew. He just never used it. He almost laughed, a small, hollow sound. That was Walter. He collected truths the way other people collect debts. Held them. Waited to see if he'd ever need them. He needed this one, Sarah said. He just didn't live long enough to use it. Hollis turned to look at her then. Really look at her. And Sarah held his gaze the way she had learned to hold difficult things. Steadily, without flinching, without performing courage she didn't feel. What do you want from me? He asked. I want you to choose, she said simply. Help us finish what Walter started. Or spend the rest of your life wondering if we managed it without you. She paused. Walter gave Marcus Hale a choice. Once. You were in the room. You saw how that ended. Hollis was quiet for a very long time. The rain came down steadily. The highway beyond the rest stop moved. With indifferent traffic. What do you need? He finally said. The plan took 9 days to build and was, in its essentials, something Walter would have recognized immediately, because Sarah had built it entirely from things he taught her. The core of it was simple, the way dangerous things often are. Edmund Carr would never expose himself for a threat. He was too old, too careful, too surrounded by insulation and intermediaries. But he would move. He would have to move, if he believed the decoded notebook was about to become public. Not through official channels, which he had spent 40 years learning to manage, but directly, uncontrollably, the kind of exposure that didn't pass. Through a single point he could apply pressure to. Victor built the technical architecture. Diana handled the operational logistics. Hollis, using his position for the last time in ways that cost him something, created the official scaffolding that would make it all hold when it mattered. And Sarah was the face of it. The young woman with the notebook. The diner waitress from Millbrook, who didn't know what she had. The kind of person that men like Edmund Carr had spent their entire careers dismissing as irrelevant. She stood in front of Victor's mirror the morning of the operation, and took stock of herself. Not the way she used to, self-consciously, quickly, the way you check yourself before a shift, but slowly, deliberately. Walter's voice in her ear, the most invisible person in the world, is the one everyone has already stopped looking at. She had spent her whole life being that person without knowing it. Was a skill. Now she was going to use it on purpose. Diana appeared in the doorway behind her reflection. How do you feel? Diana asked. Ready, Sarah said. Diana studied her for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Something quiet and private that she didn't put into words, but that Sarah understood anyway. It was the look of someone who recognized, in another person, the presence of a teacher they'd both loved. Then let's go, Diana said. Edmund Carr sent an intermediary first. Of course he did. He hadn't survived 91 years by making direct contact with loose ends himself. A man Sarah didn't recognize. Approached her outside a coffee shop, handed her a card with an address and a time, and walked away without a word. She had 40 minutes to make a decision she'd already made. The address was a private townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of building that looks like a family home and contains, Sarah knew from Victor's research, the most sophisticated private security system money had produced in the last decade. She went in alone. Edmund Carr was already there when she arrived, sitting in a leather chair beside a fireplace that wasn't lit, dressed with the quiet, understated precision of a man who had always understood that real power doesn't announce itself. He was smaller than she had imagined. Old men of tremendous power often are. The world has spent so long constructing a larger version of them in its collective imagination that the physical reality comes as a surprise. But his eyes were not small. They were sharp and patient and completely, utterly unafraid. The eyes of a man who had looked at threatening situations from the other side of the table for so long that the experience had become simply another kind of waiting room. Sit down, please, he said. Sarah Saturday. You're not what I expected, he said, studying her with the same frank, assessing attention she'd seen in Walter's eyes, the professional habit of seeing people accurately rather than conveniently. People say that, Sarah said. I imagined someone more frightened. I learned from someone who didn't frighten easily. Something crossed his face at that, there and gone, faster than an expression and slower than a reflex. Something that might, in another man, have been respect. Walter Hayes was a remarkable man, he said. One of the finest operatives I ever had occasion to observe, from a distance, you understand. We were never on the same side of anything, but I could appreciate the craftsmanship. A pause. It's a genuine shame he couldn't simply have let things rest. He let things rest for 23 years, Sarah said. He was just waiting. For what? For the right person to hand it to. Edmund Carr looked at her steadily for a long moment. The fireplace ticked with the settling of the grate. Outside, the city moved past without any awareness of what was happening in this quiet room. The notebook, he said finally. What's in it won't hold up. You understand that. I've had 40 years to make sure that nothing holds up. My name is in no official file. No court will. The notebook isn't the only thing, Sarah said. She reached into her bag and placed a small device on the table. Between them, a recorder. Running. Carr looked at it. Then at her. Walter taught me, she said quietly, that the most powerful weapon is the one the other person doesn't know you're carrying. And then, because Walter had also taught her that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply wait, she said nothing more. Edmund Carr was silent for a very long time. The recorder ran. And the man who had spent 40 years ensuring that nothing could ever be proven against him heard, in that silence, the specific quality of an ending. He had made one mistake in 40 years of careful, patient work. He had underestimated the person across the table. He had looked at Sarah Mitchell, a young woman from a small town, a diner waitress, nobody, and he had been so confident in his assessment of her that he had walked into a room alone and begun to talk, just as she'd intended. When federal agents came through the door 12 minutes later, Edmund Carr did not resist. He did not shout. He stood with the careful, deliberate composure of a man who had always known, somewhere underneath everything, that this moment existed somewhere in his future. He looked at Sarah one last time as they let him out. She held his gaze. In that final look was something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not hatred, but a kind of acknowledgement. Man to man, operative to operative. The recognition of a professional who had simply, finally, been outplayed. She thought of Walter. She thought he would have liked that. The operation's success was not the end of anything clean. Nothing about this world was clean. Walter had tried to show her that the good outcomes still leave marks. Victor was gone within 48 hours, relocated through channels that Hollis had quietly activated before handing in his badge to a city and a life that Sarah would never have the address of. He left a note on his whiteboard, erased almost completely. One phrase still faintly visible in the ghost of dry erase marker. Good luck, Mitchell. She photographed it before she left. Diana said goodbye on a sidewalk outside a parking garage at 5 in the morning, the city still grey and quiet around them. It wasn't a long goodbye. Diana was not a woman who did long goodbyes. The profession had trained that out of her decades ago, if it had ever been there to begin with. She put her hand on Sarah's arm for a moment. That was all. But her eyes said something that her voice didn't, something about Walter, and about loss, and about the particular loneliness of people who do necessary things that history never records and that nobody ever thanks them for. Sarah understood. She was beginning to understand a great many things she hadn't had language for 6 months ago. Hollis resigned that same week. No ceremony. No farewell address. A letter delivered through official channels, accepted without comment. 30 years of service ended with a signature on a form and a badge left in an in tray. Sarah heard through Diana, weeks later, that he had moved to a small house in a coastal town, that he fished in the mornings, that he seemed, by all accounts, lighter. She was glad. She found that she genuinely was. The story that reached the press was a fraction of what had happened. Language carefully chosen, names carefully obscured, the full scope of the network summarized in 2 paragraphs of a congressional report that most people skimmed and few understood. Edmund Carr's name appeared in a court filing as Individual A. Walter Hayes's name appeared nowhere. That was, Sarah knew by now, exactly how it always went. Exactly how Walter had always known it would go. The people who do the essential work of the world from the shadows do not get to step into the light at the end. The world doesn't reorganize itself to acknowledge them. The world continues, slightly safer, entirely unaware of the debt it's carrying. She sat with that for a long time. And then she made her peace with it, the way Walter had made his peace with 23 years of a diner booth. Millbrook in November was bare-treed and cold, the kind of cold that arrived early in small towns and stayed long after it had been asked to leave. Sarah had her shifts. She had her nursing school application, finally submitted, finally with a real chance at the scholarship she'd been putting off for 2 years. She had Walter's grave, which she visited. On Sunday mornings with coffee she could no longer quite bring herself to drink before she'd stood there a while. She had the notebook, both of them now. The old one, full, every page decoded and copied and delivered to people who would carry the work forward. The new one, her own, slowly filling with the story she was writing the way Walter had asked her to. She had changed in ways she was still cataloguing. The way she sat in rooms now, always with the door in her sight line. The way she noticed things other people moved past, the car that had been parked in the same spot for too long, the person whose eyes moved before their head did. The way she paid attention to people that the world had decided weren't worth paying attention to. That last one was the most important. That one was Walter's real legacy, and she knew it. On a Tuesday evening, closing shift, she was wiping down the counter when she noticed the young man in the corner. He'd been there 2 hours. She hadn't registered him consciously. Until now, which was itself a tell, she was getting better at noticing the things that her mind tried to file under background. Mid-20s. Mismatched clothes. Talking quietly to himself. Eyes that moved oddly, not with the scattered vacancy she might have expected, but with a specific, controlled pattern, like someone doing surveillance work so thoroughly internalized it had become tick. Every other person in the diner had arranged themselves, without realizing it, to avoid his section. Nobody looked at him directly. Nobody would. Sarah picked up the coffee pot. She walked across the diner the way Walter had once walked through his own home, with purpose, without hurry, in the knowledge that the most powerful position in any room is the one nobody else thought to take. She stopped at the young man's table. He looked up. His eyes, up close, were not confused. They were exhausted. They were the eyes of someone carrying something very heavy for a very long time, alone, with no certainty that their weight would never be worth what it cost. She recognized that look. She had seen it in a diner booth every morning for 2 years and did not understand what she was seeing. She understood now. "Mind if I sit down?" she asked. He stared at her, cautious, ready to deflect. "I knew someone once," she said quietly, setting down the coffee pot and pulling out the chair across from him without waiting for an answer, who spent 23 years letting people think he was something he wasn't. She folded her hands on the table. He was the most remarkable person I've ever met, and nobody saw it until almost too late. The young man's jaw tightened, released. The defensive performance slipped, just slightly, just enough. "What do you want?" he said. His voice was careful, controlled. "Nothing," Sarah said. "I just noticed you." She met his eyes. "And I thought someone should." Outside, November moved past the windows. The diner hummed its ordinary hum. The world went about its business of being large and indifferent and entirely unaware of what happened in the quiet moments between the things it paid attention to. Sarah Mitchell sat across from a stranger in a diner booth. And for the first time, she was the one who had noticed someone that everyone else had already stopped looking at. She understood, finally, what Walter had given her. Not a mission. Not a legacy to complete. A way of seeing the world. A way of looking at the people the world looked past and asking, what if you're more than what anyone here believes you to be? It was the most dangerous question she knew. It was also the most important one. She poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one across the table, and she waited to hear his story. His name was Thomas Vale, and he hadn't chosen that name. Someone had chosen it for him. What he told Sarah over the next 2 hours, in that diner booth, would open a door Walter Hayes had spent 23 years trying to find the key to. A door that led to something none of them had seen coming. Not even Walter. Watch out for the part 3. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more interesting stories.